Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we are glad to welcome you to this week's History is Lunch. We're in our home here, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where you can find any of our previous History is Lunch programs available at any time. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to tell you a little change that we're doing to next week's operation for History's Lunch. And so we hope that you'll come next Wednesday and join us a little bit early at 11 a.m. for a special showing of A Chance for Change. A Chance for Change is a teacher training film produced by the Scientific Film Services for the Child Development Group of Mississippi, CDGM, in the summer of 1965. And this film highlights the Second Pilgrim's Rest Center in Durant, Holmes County, which was among the best of the CDGM programs. Filmed with the staff, parents, and children, it features CDGM the teacher guide Hattie Bell Saffold, and teacher Doris Derby. Again, this program is going to take place at 11 a.m. next week right here in the auditorium, so come join us. We'll have some extra coffee and cookies to help make you through the extra little bit. The film is right at 37 minutes, so we'll have a nice little intermission break before we hop into our 60th anniversary Head Start program for History's Lunch next Wednesday at noon. So if you still can't make it for the 11, we'd love to still have you at noon. There'll be a nice break for you to come in and join us. But we'd love to have you for that hour early for that documentary screening. But today we are incredibly excited to welcome friend Jere Nash and his presentation on his latest book, Reconstruction in Mississippi, 1862 to 1877. Jere's a native of Greenville, Mississippi, and has served as a political consultant for over 45 years. He is the author and co-author of several books of Mississippi history, including his first book, Mississippi Politics, The Struggle for Power, 1976 to 2006, which he co-wrote with Andy Taggart, which also won awards from the Mississippi Historical Society and the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters. Jere also authored a special edition article of the Journal of Mississippi History in 2002, and we have a number of those copies in addition to Jere's book that'll be available for purchase afterwards. And this was a special edition of the Journal of Mississippi History because it was the only correct Brother Rogers edition that is in color. And so we'd love for you to have a chance to buy that copy of the journal today. But without further ado, let's give Jere Nash a round of applause.
You can hear me over there. We go. There we go. A few introductory remarks. I am old and worn out. Certainly my vocal cords are. And from time to time, I will be taking these throat lozenges to lubricate those vocal cords. So, from time to time when I do that, you are clear and welcome to raise your hand and use that as an excuse to ask a question. So feel free to do that, and certainly any other time. This book, Reconstruction in Mississippi, is part of what's called the Heritage of Mississippi series. It's a collaboration between the Department of Archives and History, the University Press of Mississippi, and the Mississippi Historical Society. Close to 12 volumes of different periods of Mississippi history have been published as part of that series. And many years ago, when no one had chosen that period of Mississippi history called Reconstruction, the committee, in a very weak moment, allowed me to write that book. And so I want to thank the Department of Archives and History, University Press, if anyone is here from the press, over here, Craig Gill, and Mississippi Historical Society. I want to say a special word of thanks for Brother Rogers and for Craig Gill. Those are the two people primarily responsible for getting this book written and published. I started working on this 12 years ago and would write a chapter and then run some campaigns write a chapter, work on another book, write a chapter, work on something for the Journal of Mississippi History. And finally, brother called me up. He said, Nash, are you going to do this? With 10 minutes later, Craig calls me up. Nash, are you going to do this? We really would like to publish this book. And for the next several months, much shame came my way and motivated me to finish the book. And I give Brother Rogers great credit. Craig Gill, please give them a round of applause. Soon after I had signed the contract to write this book with the late Elbert Hilliard, who was the volunteer staff guy for the Mississippi Historical Society. He and I met and I signed the contract. A couple of days later, I'm in some building in downtown Jackson, I can't remember which, and got on the elevator, going up some floor, and before the doors closed, Alan Huffman got on the elevator with me. Some of you may know Alan, author. He and I go way, way back. And Alan said, Nash, good to see you. What are you up to? And, you know, I had just signed this contract, thought I knew something about Reconstruction. I was, you know, feeling pretty good about myself. And rather than say, Alan, you know, I've just signed the contract, just started the research, I'm really not sure what this book on Reconstruction is going to be about, but let's get together and talk about it. But when he said, Nash, what's your book going to be about? I then launched off on the 2 or 3 minutes worth of incoherent nonsense. I thought I knew something, but I didn't, but I wasn't going to let that stop me from talking about what I thought I knew about Reconstruction. The door opened to the elevator, and as Alan is getting out of the elevator, he turns to me and he says, Nash, you need to work on your elevator speech. So, Alan, this book on Reconstruction in Mississippi is about freedom. It's about the meaning of freedom. In May and April of 1865, 4 million black men, women, and children who had been enslaved their entire lives gained their freedom. First through the Emancipation Proclamation, then through the end of the war itself, and finally in December of 1875 with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. I make the case that that is the first time in America's history that the country came to grips with what it meant to be free. Yes, sir, you raise your hand. No, but for the country. He's just saying that obviously Mississippi didn't ratify it until late, but in terms of it becoming constitutional law, it was ratified by 3/4 of the states in December of 1865. Sure. But regardless, slavery was illegal in Mississippi because of the 13th Amendment. So, in May and April of 1865, the country had to come to grips with what it meant for 4 million black men, women, and children to become full citizens of the country. Think about what the country was like in November of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Slavery was legal. In a country where we talk about freedom, slavery was legal. probably the most unfree thing that a country can do is have legalized slavery. There was no equal protection of the law in the Constitution that prevented any kind of discrimination. That would come later. In the federal Constitution, there was no mention of the word vote. There was no federal right for a person to be able to vote in an election. When the Constitution was written in 1789, voting was the exclusive province of the states. So each state could determine who was going to vote, how they were going to vote, and in what manner they were going to vote. And in Mississippi, there was no education system. In fact, in Mississippi, state law made it illegal for slaves to read, learn how to write, learn how to do math. All of that would change in the 10 years after the Civil War, when the country tried to decide what it meant for people in America to be free. As one congressman said on the floor of the House in 1869, what is freedom? Is it the mere absence of slavery, or is it something more than that? And that's a question that we've been debating in this country ever since, what it means to be a free American. For the 10 years after the war, they adopted the 13th Amendment and prohibited slavery. They adopted the 14th Amendment, which created a national definition of what it meant to be an American citizen. Some of you who know your constitutional law know that in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case held that even former slaves, much less enslaved men and women, were not citizens of the country, could not be citizens of the country. So the 14th Amendment, passed in Reconstruction, not only defined what it meant to be an American citizen, created a due process clause and an equal protection clause to prohibit discrimination. And finally, in 1870, they passed the 15th Amendment, which for the first time in the country's history wrote into the Constitution that we have a right to vote. And in that case, it was a right to vote limited to black and white men. But it's the first time that those words showed up in the Constitution. And in Mississippi, the coalition of black and white Republicans who ran state government from 1870 to 1875 created the state's first comprehensive public school system. And if you go back and read the bill that they passed in the winter of 1870, it is almost identical to the system we still have to govern public schools in Mississippi today. County boards of education, county superintendents of education, municipal districts, municipal boards, municipal superintendents, state board of education, state superintendent of education. You sort of go through the bill and you're thinking, now in 1870, 90% of Mississippians lived in rural parts of the state. There were hardly any municipal areas. The framers of the legislation in 1870 could never have conceived of a metro area in the middle of the state that has 600,000 people crammed into 3 counties. But we still run school systems just like they did in 1870. In many ways, we still teach like they did in 1870. But in 1870, that was the first time that a state like Mississippi had ever created a statewide system of education. So by the end of 1875, freedom had more or less been defined by those reforms to the federal Constitution. Black men and women who had been enslaved in Mississippi, who gained their freedom, pretty quickly came to the consensus that they needed 3 things in order to sustain their freedom in Mississippi. The right to vote. Alan Huffman, I see you there. Thank you, sir. Thank you for coming. The right to vote, the right to an education, and the right to own land. They essentially said, if I have my own plot of land to farm, and if I have the ability to teach my children to read and write, teach myself to read and write, so I can sign and negotiate contracts, land titles, and if I have the right to vote to determine people who are going to influence and control the government, then I can sustain my freedom. And so my book covers the ups and downs of how that happened in Mississippi and how successful they were or how unsuccessful they were. But Reconstruction is a lot more than the mechanics of Mississippi sort of rejoining the Union. It's an attempt to determine what it means to be free and what is required for men and women and children in Mississippi and this country to be free. And it's something that we debate today. We celebrate it every July the 4th. We talk about how important freedom is. But in April and May of 1865, the country finally had to come to grips with what that meant, sort of putting meat on the bones, if you will. I'm going to have to take a lozenge. So if anybody has a question, feel free to ask. Most people, when they think of Reconstruction, they think of Mississippi leaving the Union and Mississippi rejoining the Union. Katie Blunt and I had this question a long time ago, and when I was doing the research for the book. And in December of 2017, Mississippi was celebrating, of course, its 200th anniversary of the state. Now, if you believe, as the white men did in Jackson, Mississippi in January of 1861, when they approved the Articles of Secession, that they were leaving the Union, that they were becoming a sovereign state, leaving the federal government, and they were either going to survive as a sovereign state by themselves or join with other states and form a new country. They believed that that was possible. And of course, the words we all use, leaving the Union, and in January of 1870, Mississippi, quote, rejoined the Union when Congress passed legislation authorizing that. If Mississippi actually left the Union for 9 years, did we have that celebration out here 9 years too early? The answer, of course, is in 1869, the U.S. Supreme Court said it takes two to tango. States cannot leave unilaterally. They have to be concurred in by the federal government. But who did leave were Mississippi's two United States senators, Jefferson Davis and Albert Brown, and its 5 members of Congress. January of 1861, they resigned their posts, came to Jackson, joined the Secession Convention. And you may know that members of Congress have almost unilateral authority to determine who they want to seat in Congress, what kind of qualifications they want to impose on somebody that they agree to seat in the Senate or the House. And so part of Reconstruction is what Mississippi had to do to meet requirements of the Republicans in Congress for its 2 senators and its 5 representatives to resume representation in Congress. And that's sort of the correct usage of the term. Mississippi never left the Union. It had to do certain things in order for its elected representatives to resume representation in Congress, to continue to resume representing the state and the citizens in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. And so part of the book covers what those requirements were and how they were met from 1865 until 1870. So that's sort of the common sense of Reconstruction, Mississippi getting its legislators back in Washington, and sort of this broader idea of what came to me in doing all of the research, that there was much more involved than that, and it was the country and Mississippi coming to terms with what it meant to be free. But I make the case in the book that all of that came to an end in 1875, in November of 1875, when legislative elections were held for all the members of the House and half the members of the state Senate. And in that battle in November of 1875 to determine the future direction of the state, there were three people who mattered. Adelbert Ames, the Republican governor of Mississippi, elected in 1873, titular head of the Republican Party. J.Z. George, lawyer from Carroll County, the campaign manager for the Democrats, and Ulysses S. Grant. George's his priority concern was keeping Grant and the federal government out of Mississippi so he could run an unfair election. Ames's only priority was to do what it took to get Grant and the federal troops into Mississippi to ensure a fair election. George was by far the more talented and effective campaign manager, and he succeeded in a variety of ways, which are explained in the book. Very talented guy, knew exactly what he was doing, and Ames, on the other hand, was lost and had no idea what he was up to. George succeeded. Grant, federal troops stayed out of Mississippi, and the white Democrats stole the election, essentially, by engaging in a number of fraudulent attempts, fraudulent practices to win elections at the precinct and at the ballot box. Again, in the course of this research, what I learned is that the way in which we vote today is not the way they voted in 1875. In 1875, government did not run the election. They did not print the ballot. They did not stipulate how the procedures would take place at each precinct. In those days, you voted by party ballot. You walked in with a Republican ticket, you walked in with a Democratic ticket. They were either produced by the parties, you cut them out of the newspaper, you could even handwrite your own. And you walked into the precinct, there was the box, and you stuck your ballot into the box. There certainly wasn't no voter ID. There wasn't a list there that you had to sign. You just walked in and you deposited your ballot. And in many of those precincts, George and his lieutenants successfully put their own people in those precinct locations. And after voting had closed down, it was pretty easy to sort of open the box, take out a handful of Republican Party tickets, and out of your back pocket put in a handful of Democratic Party tickets. I sort of, being an old campaign manager, did my own analysis and sort of developed how many white men over the age of 21 were living in each county in November of 1875, and how many black men over the age of 21 were living in each county. And then I compared the results. And by November of 1875, it was almost a black and white election, except for a few white Republicans left. Most white Republicans had left the party for a variety of reasons, and it was almost a black and white election. And in all of those counties that white Democrats carried, defeating Republican candidates, the percentage of vote was well over 100%, of what that figure would be, of how many white men over the age of 21 were living in a county. In Yazoo County, where they had, my memory's not good, 4,200 votes for the Democrat and 4 votes for the Republican, even though it was a majority black county. That was 210% more than the eligible white male number of voters. And so I go through that in the analysis in 1875 election to sort of show how they did it. But in the course of that, learned how people voted back in 1875. Earlier than that, back when this country was started, when there were these early elections, people voted the old phrase, viva voce. Men walked into the polling place, somebody was there with a pad, and you sort of voted out loud, a show of a manhood to walk in and demonstrate who you're voting for, and somebody writes it down. No secret. Of course, everybody knew who you're voting for. It sort of calls into question every election from 1789 to 1875. If the tally was being written down by someone, reported to someone else just because someone came in and said, this is who I'm voting for. But in any event, it had progressed by 1875 to at least you voted with some paper, but it still was not secret and certainly subject to intimidation. And so that is a overview, if you will, of the book and what I've learned in doing the research, that Mississippi never left the Union. Its legislators left the Union. The state had to do a variety of things to have those people reseated. But it really was about determining what it meant to be a free Mississippian or a free American. The consequences of the 1875 election had the longest tenure of any election in Mississippi's history. I make the case that it's the single most important election that's ever been held in the state. Because when the white Democrats won the election in 1875, they were able to take over state government. January of 1876, they impeached Ames, the governor, impeached the black lieutenant governor, impeached the black superintendent of education, and essentially took over state government. And over the ensuing years, they imposed the most rigid, the most brutal, and the most immoral form of government called Jim Crow. The nice term, of course, is segregation. And if you think about it, it lasted from 1875 until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. 90 years, the consequences of one election. And Mississippi has never been the same since. And of course, it began to change in 1964, 1965, school desegregation, 1969. The last time federal troops were in Mississippi was in December of 1874 when Grant sent them to Vicksburg to restore order after a massacre there. Everybody in this room knows the next time federal troops came to Mississippi, September of 1962, on the campus of Ole Miss. 1874, 1962, the federal government essentially let Mississippi and the South do whatever they wanted to do. The Supreme Court allowed Mississippi and other southern states to also do whatever they wanted to do in a variety of rulings which upheld segregation. And that's what happened through one election to have those consequences. So that's sort of my overview of Reconstruction. I now wanted to talk about my favorite part of the book, which is about messaging. I'm one of the guys who believes that whoever controls the message controls the political outcome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. How are we on time, brother? Okay. So does anybody have any questions about Reconstruction or what we talked about? Yes, sir, John.
What were the bases for impeachment of the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House that you mentioned earlier?
Well, you've heard the term fake news. When you read the articles of impeachment, it was mostly made up, mostly exaggerated, but it was all about corruption. They fabricated, particularly related to the superintendent of education, they fabricated a lot of corruption charges against him and against Davis, the lieutenant governor. For Ames, they started with an impeachment list of, I think, can't remember, of 21 articles, and then 3 days later they came back and added 7 more. It was literally throwing in the kitchen sink, so to speak. I didn't spend a lot of time reading them in detail and parsing them out just because they didn't either. It was clear they just wrote whatever they wanted to write because they had 2/3 vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate. They pretty quickly voted to impeach with 2/3 in the House. They actually held a trial, I think, for the lieutenant governor in the Senate and found him guilty. The superintendent resigned, and then Ames and his supporters worked out a deal with the Democrats that he would resign if they would withdraw the articles of impeachment, which they did. And by March, April of 1876, a guy named Stone, who had been the pro tem president of the Senate, was named governor. And it was all over after that. Yes, ma'am.
Were there cases brought from Mississippi that made it to the Supreme Court during that time that were rejected and enabled Mississippi to continue things with the way they had been doing?
The most fascinating thing I learned in doing the first book that Andy Taggart and I wrote about contemporary Mississippi politics, I knew nothing about what's called the white primary. So in 1901, 1902, when sort of populism was running through the country, and there was a move to require primary elections, primary nominations to be held by election rather than by convention. Prior to 1901, in Mississippi, all of the Democratic or Republican nominees for state office were nominated in a convention of delegates from all over the state. 1901, 1902, Mississippi, like a lot of other states, created elections, primary elections, to make those nominations. What happened in Mississippi and in other southern states was there was a provision in the law which said the Democratic Party, which is hosting the election, it's not a, quote, state official election, the Mississippi Democratic Party is going to hold this election to determine its nominee, that the Democratic Party can meet as an executive committee, and the party can choose who it wants to allow to participate in its primary election. So right after the law was passed, the Democratic Party met in Mississippi, and they said only white men are allowed to participate in our primary elections. I knew nothing of this. I always thought that the 1890 Constitution disenfranchised black voters, which it did to a point. But in 1902, the white primary law made it total. And you couldn't even walk up to a primary precinct if you were a black man in Mississippi at the time. On several occasions, plaintiffs from other southern states, like Mississippi, appealed this to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in a variety of cases, until 1944, they upheld that practice. So for 40 years in Mississippi, when you go back and you look at primary election returns, that's only white men voting. And of course, after 1920, white men and women. That's one of many examples where the Supreme Court sort of gave their okay to what was happening in the South. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. As we look at this period of Reconstruction, we did have Hiram Revels, we had John R. Lynch, and they were elected, duly elected, and they went to Congress and all. Put their participation into the perspective of the years that you're talking about.
I talk a lot in the book about Hiram Revels and John Lynch and Blanche Bruce.
Blanche Bruce.
The very first time I even have a memory of what Reconstruction was or what it meant was in November of 1986. I was helping Mike Espy in his election for Congress. And after he won, some of you may remember all of the media accounts said, Mike Espy, the first black congressman in Mississippi since Reconstruction.
Right.
Well, of course, I couldn't pull out my phone and say, Siri, tell me who the first one was in 1986. And so I just sort of forgot about it and didn't think about it anymore. And it turns out that the first black congressman in Mississippi was not a Democrat, but a Republican, John Lynch from Natchez. John Lynch, all of this is sort of fresh in my mind because last night I spoke to the Natchez Historical Society, talked to them about the book, because John Lynch and Hiram Revels got their start in Natchez. John Lynch was an enslaved man in Louisiana, freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, made his way to Natchez, became a very successful business person, got involved in Republican Party politics. Hiram Revels was a Methodist minister called by a church in Natchez. Lynch convinced Revels to run for the Senate, the state Senate, in 1869. Lynch ran for the House in 1869. And in 1870, when the coalition of black and white Republicans who controlled state government then had to nominate U.S. senators, they nominated Ames and James Alcorn and Hiram Revels for 3 different slots. And Revels became the first black man to ever serve in the United States Senate. And if you think about it, from 1789 to 1966, when Edward Brooke was elected to the U.S. Senate from Massachusetts, black Republican, 1789 to 1966, only 2 black men served in the U.S. Senate, both of them from Mississippi, both of them from Reconstruction era, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. And she says, could blacks vote during that period of time? And it's my fault I hadn't made it clear that certainly during the Reconstruction era, black men gained the right to vote, not only through the 15th Amendment, but by writing a new Constitution in 1868, 1869, which gave black men the right to vote. No question. And then that right was taken away in the ensuing years, the Constitution of 1890, and then, of course, the white primary. Yeah. Any other Reconstruction question? Yes, sir.
I was kind of curious to see in your perspective what consequences occur still today, and then if there's any solution to those consequences from that election.
All right, so you and I don't have 24 hours to go down that road. But I will make you this observation. So y'all bear with me for a minute. I want you to think about this geographically. When Mississippi became a state in 1817, the northern border, you know, was the 35th parallel, separating Mississippi from Tennessee. When you draw the 35th parallel over to the Mississippi River, it falls just short of Memphis, south of Memphis, which was the best deep water port on the Mississippi from St. Louis to New Orleans. So Tennessee got Memphis, Mississippi didn't get it. When the white men established the north-south border from Alabama and Mississippi, and they ran the line from Tennessee down to the Gulf, they gave the port of Mobile to Alabama, which is the best deep water port from New Orleans to Tampa, to Miami. And when they were doing the western boundary of Mississippi, and it's very long and complicated, and it's a great story, they stopped at the 31st parallel, which was sort of the Florida Panhandle. You draw it all the way over to the Mississippi River. And when they decided to give the area south between the 31st parallel and the Gulf to Alabama and Mississippi, they stopped for Mississippi at the Pearl River rather than go all the way to the Mississippi River. So Louisiana got New Orleans. So in those days, Memphis, Mobile, and New Orleans all went to other states. Ultimately, of course, you know, Birmingham got lucky with coal. Louisiana got lucky with oil and gas. Mississippi was landlocked. I mean, you can sit on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and it's the only part of the Gulf Coast you can sit and not hear the roar of the waves because of the damn barrier islands. If you want to hear the great waves of the Gulf, you have to go out to the barrier islands. It was nothing but swamps and mud on Mississippi's Gulf Coast. So Mississippi had nothing that would have been advantageous. So if you think about it, the only thing Mississippi had as a resource to grow and prosper were its people. Were its people. And you know what happened. In 1875, 55% of the population was African American. Well into the 1910, got up to 61%. White Democrats decided that we were going to make African Americans third and fourth class citizens through segregation and Jim Crow. We were not going to let black men and women participate in the affairs of the state. We were not going to educate black children so that they could participate in the affairs of the state. And even though there's not a term like Jim Crow that you could apply to what white men did to white women, they were not treated as third and fourth class citizens, but certainly second class citizens for much of that same period. So if you have a state where less than a quarter of the population is trying to be the only part of the population that participates in the economic and political well-being of the state, you're gonna be last. You're gonna be last. And that's what happened. And unless there's a concerted effort to invest in the only and best resource that the state has, which are its people, it's always going to be last. And it just happened because of this geographical bad luck that we got, that Mississippi in 1875, South Carolina and Mississippi were the only two states that were majority black. So when you just so happened that majority black in Mississippi, so much of the human resources were relegated to third and fourth class status. Even though they were relegated to third and fourth class status in North Carolina and Alabama and Arkansas, it didn't have near the impact that it did here because they didn't constitute a majority of the population. And of course, Alabama got Birmingham, Alabama got Mobile, Georgia, South Carolina, they got everything on the Atlantic Ocean. Louisiana got New Orleans. Tennessee got Memphis and Chattanooga. We got none of it. We got none of it. Yes, sir.
Jerry, we've got one more over here on this side of the room real quick.
Oh, okay.
and we'll move
All right.
around.
Jerry, I really appreciate the talk thus far, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. You mentioned the political aspects and the manipulation of the election in 1875. You mentioned also the Vicksburg Massacre. To what degree does the violent voter suppression that comes out of earlier than the Vicksburg Massacre, but really reaches its peak with Vicksburg and Clinton and several others, also play a part in suppressing black voter participation?
Well, it's a great question because it allows me to put on my campaign manager hat. In 1874, in the spring and fall, there were city elections in Vicksburg, county elections in the county of Warren. White Democrats made a decision to try and take over the municipal government in the spring of 1864. But they did it not by using overt terror and overt intimidation. They used it by more fraudulent means. And they were able to elect a white Democrat as mayor of Vicksburg. But the white guys in the county just couldn't help themselves. They just launched off into a full-blown massacre of county officials, including the black sheriff, black supervisors, and others, and ultimately ended up killing 200 to 300 people over the course of November and December 1864. And it was because they were so transparent in the use of terror that Grant dispatched soldiers to reinstore order there in Warren County. But J.Z. George saw that. He saw what happened in the municipal elections, and he saw what happened in the county elections. And he said to his colleagues, if we use that kind of terror in trying to win the election in 1875, Grant will surely send federal troops here. We have to be better at it. We have to be more discreet. We have to sort of do this late at night. And that's what led to the ballot manipulation. George learned from what happened in Warren County, and he learned from what happened in Vicksburg. Very smart guy. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, mainly with the African American men who were elected during Reconstruction after 1875. What happened to Rainey, who was Speaker Pro Tem? I think I read that J.R. Lynch went to Washington, D.C. I understand some were killed. I know about Clinton and the massacre. Could you just speak a moment about what happened to those?
Revels stayed in Mississippi. Revels served 1.5 years in the U.S. Senate. Y'all will love this. During the fight on the floor of the legislature in 1870 to create the public school system, you will know that the single most controversial issue they had to address was whether or not they were going to allow black children and white children to attend the same school. Because the coalition of white and black Republicans held a majority, they were able to beat back amendments from white Democrats to require segregated schools. So the bill that was passed in 1870 had no mention of separated schools. Well, Mississippi at that time only had one university. And we know what university that was, up there at Oxford. And white folks started panicking. Because if they can do that to these new public schools, they can do that to Ole Miss. And we can have black folks show up at Ole Miss. Well, in addition to George being a very smart politician, James Alcorn was a very smart politician, then governor of Mississippi. And Alcorn, he needed to do something to take the pressure off what was circulating around Mississippi. And so he took advantage of a federal act. Some of you will know it as the Morrill Act, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, which created the land grant system of colleges and universities in America. The second one ever established was established in southwest Mississippi and became known as Alcorn State University. Of course, then it was called something else. But it was established by the legislature at the same time as a college and university for black men, as a way of saying, we're going to create this brand new university so black men will be able to go to college, so that there'll be less pressure on what's happening at Ole Miss. And you know, your 8 institutions of higher learning, only one of them is named after a person, and still is, Alcorn State University. Still named after the governor, James Alcorn, who established it in 1870. So Revels, that's a very long-winded answer to your question. Revels was the first president of Alcorn State University. Revels stayed in Mississippi until he died, moved to Holly Springs, ministered a variety of churches in North Mississippi. Died at a Methodist convention in Monroe County, and he was 73, 74. John R. Lynch, David Bowen, lived to be 93, just like this gentleman right over here. He left Mississippi and moved to lots of places, but ended up in Chicago and died as a prosperous lawyer in Chicago. Wrote 4 books, including his autobiography. Blanche Bruce, the first black senator to serve a full term, stayed in Washington after his term was ended, took several federal positions with the government in Washington. In fact, I forget what the official title was, but President Cleveland, maybe, I can't remember which president it was in those years, appointed him Register of the Treasury. And Blanche Bruce became the first black man to have his name on dollar bills as the signature of dollar bills. So they all lived long lives. Yeah.
Jerry,
Yes, sir.
we've got about 10 more minutes. I want to make sure you have some time to get to your messaging segment, and then we can go to more
All
questions.
right. Well, there are a lot of questions, but I want to leave with you a John Lynch anecdote, because it's a great anecdote to how elections. You know, I have this thing around my head, and it's a little difficult to think. Some of you may remember from the first book that Andy and I wrote, and it's an anecdote that we used to share all the time in speeches, and it was a Cliff Finch anecdote. Cliff Finch was elected governor in November of 1975. I'm way off. He would have fit right in, though. In any event, (1975), Finch is elected governor, and we have this great anecdote told to us by 2 people who were in the room. Finch was late at night, that Tuesday night, and he had a big room in his campaign headquarters. He was at a desk in the corner, and everybody was waiting on returns coming in. And in those days, you remember, some of you who look like I do will remember the push-button phones, where you had to push the button in order to engage a line. And sitting next to the phone was a big box, which was the speakerphone. And so the returns from Prentiss County had not come in, and they were all waiting on Oliver Eaton, Finch's Prentiss County campaign coordinator, to call in with the returns. Finally, Eaton calls in, and Finch sort of pushes the button and then opens the speakerphone so that everybody in the room can hear Oliver Eaton say, "Cliff, Cliff, this is Oliver Eaton. We've got you 2,000 votes ahead right now in Prentiss County. If you need more than that, I got to know now. I got to know now." The same thing happened in 1875, 100 years earlier. John R. Lynch had been elected to Congress 2 years earlier and was up for re-election. 1875, white Democrats gained control of much of the election machinery and were trying to not only elect white Democratic legislators who were on the ballot, but that year the members of Congress were also on the ballot. And they were successful in electing 4 Democrats, 5 Democrats in the other congressional seats, but in District 6, which was Southwest Mississippi and the Gulf Coast, was John R. Lynch, the incumbent, who was by far a more effective politician than Adelbert Ames would ever be. And Lynch knew what was happening around the state and took precautions in his own home district. So the 2 days after the election, Lynch is at the newspaper office in Natchez. His good friend is editor of the paper. And he tells his story in his autobiography. And Lynch is there waiting for vote returns to come in. And the editor gets a telegram from the chair of the Democratic Party in Jackson saying, "Do you know what the vote spread is going to be for Lynch in Adams County? We know he's going to carry Adams County. But if the vote spread is going to be, say, something, then we have this county where we can either give the Democrat a 250 vote majority or a 500 vote majority. And we got to know whether to give it 250 vote majority or 500 vote majority, because that will depend on what you think the spread will be for Lynch in Adams County." Y'all follow me? You've done this before, right? And so the editor turns to Lynch and said, "Well, how big do you think you're going to win here?" And Lynch says, "Tell him 1,200 votes. The editor sends back a telegram, 1,200 votes. Well, 2 days later, the votes come in, and it's an 1,800 vote spread. And Lynch gets elected by 32 votes because when they heard that it was a 1,200 vote spread, they told whatever county it was, "We only need 250 votes. I, of course, didn't believe that. So I pulled out all the old records. And sure enough, there were 3 counties that had exactly 250 vote majority for the Democrat: Hancock, Marion, and Greene County. Now, I don't know which one it was that they were going to think about bumping up to 500, but they never did. And so Lynch is writing in his autobiography, he ends that section with, "The disappointment and chagrin on the part of the Democratic managers can better be imagined than described." So they didn't have anything on Oliver Eaton and Cliff Finch 100 years earlier. So how much time do we have?
We got a few more minutes left for
Okay.
questions, so we've got time for about 2 more.
All right. Yes, sir.
Recunstruction and ever involved a black person or made black performance in service academy. And after many weeks of research, they came back and said, no, none has been done, and none at all. I said, well, I never campaigned on it, I didn't talk about it, but I thought it was a good time to do it. So I named Henry Miles Greenville, not that person. remember we had the whole delegation making black appointments to our congressional offices and making appointments to churches.
Just so you know, Henry Miles, who you said he helped, served on the Greenville School Board with my father during integration. Yes, sir.
Oh yes. I didn't think I would purchase another book on Reconstruction. but anyway, you must. I can just tell you had to do a lot of reading. Now I looked at Foner's book. You know, Foner. I mean, okay. What kind of assistant did you have? Assistant.
What kind of assistant did I have?
Yeah,
an assistant.
Like Foner, they had a whole team.
Oh.
Du Bois had quite a few. Did you have it? And will it be adopted by the state?
This was not written to be a textbook. So it can be used by any teacher at any time that he or she wants to use it. It doesn't have to be adopted by anybody. In the acknowledgments, I thanked a whole lot of people who helped me throughout the 12-year process. Yeah. All right. Yes, ma'am.
What role did Caldwell play in the Reconstruction in Mississippi in your book?
Charles Caldwell.
Caldwell with the Clinton Massacre. A lot of us.
All right, now she is, all right, let me see if I can find it right quick, because I'd like to read it if I can find what I wrote about Charles Caldwell. Just give me 1 second. You know, I feel like a minister trying to flip through the scriptures, looking for just that right passage that, that will make the case. That's right. Well, I was just going to read you what he said, but Charles Caldwell was an enslaved man during the years leading up to the war. Gained his freedom and became a very well-known Republican political activist from the Clinton area, but sort of moved all around. Charles Caldwell had the reputation of being one of the few black men loyal to Ames who white Democrats feared, because he was so good at organizing and because he was so courageous. And at the very end of the 1875 election, when Ames had no other possibilities to ensure a fair election, he actually called out the militia, what passed for a state militia. And in a great, you can just imagine what was happening at the George campaign headquarters when he announced that Caldwell would lead one of the militia brigades. And it's probably J.Z. George's finest hour in terms of a campaign manager, because Caldwell started marching black soldiers from Jackson to Vicksburg as a show of force. And J.Z. George said it was sort of the defining moment of the campaign, because he did everything he had to do to keep white men from attacking that marching brigade. Because if white men were to have attacked black men with guns, it would have been a huge, terrible massacre. And surely then Grant would have sent troops in at that time. And for over a week, you go back and read the newspapers who are tracking Caldwell's movement through this part of Mississippi, and their daily reports on where they're going and where they're staying, where they're sleeping. And you read telegrams that George is sending to all of his people all over the area, imploring them not to do anything but to let them march. And at the end of the 1875 election, in December of 1875, when the results were in, Caldwell was tricked by one of the workers he had with him, who he had faith in, was tricked into coming out somewhere in a rural part of Hinds County to drink. And when he got there, there were 5 white men there with guns, and they assassinated him. And what I wanted to read is that there were several other black people there, and they recorded it and wrote about it and talked about it. And when one of the white men shot Caldwell, he didn't kill him, and he stood back up and said, "You look at me eye to eye before you kill me and know what I stand for." It's a great story. Great story.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know there are more questions in the room, but let's give Jerry a round of applause. Jerry will be available. We have plenty of books for you to come purchase a book, as well as a copy of the Journal of Mississippi History from 2022, where Jerry wrote a special article on the changing of the Mississippi state flag. We hope that you'll join us again next week, an hour early at 11 a.m. For that screening of A Chance for Change, and then History is Lunch to follow. But ladies and gentlemen, let's give Jerry a round of applause one more time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right.